Well, again, good morning. It's a pleasure to speak about livestock and mitigation and how to improve livestock farming. As you have noticed, there is a lot of discussion about the nitrogen problem in the Netherlands at the moment. There has been large farmers' protests, farmers driving with their tractors on the highways, going to The Hague, going to the provinces, and well, that was really quite an uprising the last 2 weeks. Due to the fact that we have high emissions from ammonia, which are a threat to nature reserves and to public health. Partly coming from agriculture, partly coming from traffic, and partly coming from industry. And at this moment, in fact, all permissions for constructing houses, constructing roads, but also constructing farmers' buildings, etc. Everything is on hold at the moment, which means that, well, this is causing a lot of problems at the moment because also building of houses just for citizens is put on hold, and we have a large shortage of houses. So this is really a struggle, and agriculture has to do part of it. And well, now is the debate how strong should these activities be. But that's part also of what we see. It's related partly to climate problems, etc. And one of the things that we see in research at the moment when it comes to housing of livestock, that is that currently in the Netherlands, housing of dairy cows, but also housing of pork, is slurry based, which means that dung and urine is collected, mixed in pits, and also applied as a slurry. And we see that this way of manure collection and manure storage is leading to high ammonia emissions. Also, the application can lead to high ammonia emissions, but since the 1990s, in the Netherlands, the ammonia emission by the livestock sector has been reduced by about 65%. But at this moment, we are still at a level that's too high to maintain nature quality. So we still should reduce the ammonia emissions by about 50%. And what we see is that from different sides now, there is a movement shifting to another type of animal housing. And this is not, well, okay, still housing where animals can walk freely, because tied animals is not accepted anymore. Also, the largest dairy in the Netherlands, Friesland Campina, is now has stopping contracts with farmers who still have tied housing. So that's really finished. But in the loose housing systems, we are now considering to change floors and go to a system where dung and urine are collected separately. Yes. For various reasons. We see that there is an increasing interest for soil quality, and we see that separation of dung and urine has a number of advantages. Slurry has to be injected due to the necessary reduction of ammonia emissions, which is also a soil disturbance, and we see that it also affects earthworms. And you need quite heavy equipment for application. And we see that this disturbance, well, as I said, not good for soil life. We also think that if you apply this in regions where we also work with nature, or where we have also nature goals, biodiversity goals in our pastures, we see that in fact the nitrogen in the slurry is still stimulating grass production too much. So from that view, we say, okay, we should go to a separation of dung and urine. Another is that we also see that in exchange with arable farmers, which is in fact increasing in the last years, because before that there was a very strict separation between arable farmers and dairy farmers. They hardly cooperated, but the cooperation is now intensifying. And there we see that also arable farmers prefer to have solid manure instead of the slurry. And from another side, from the emission side, we also see that separating dung and urine has a very high potential to reduce ammonia emissions. Current emissions from housing can be reduced by about 75%. Then it has to be based on a very rapid discharge of the urine, but also a very frequent removal of the dung. Closed storage after that, and also low emission application. And at the moment, we're starting an experiment with a group of 10 farmers in the north of the Netherlands, where we want to test these new types, because people are still in search for the most optimal types of floors, the most optimal technique for removal of manure, etc. And we also need to develop a low emission application without injection of the urine. And this can work with dilution, with water, but the point is it has to be transparent, and you must be able to control it, to check it, to prevent fraud. So this is more a technological issue than a matter of how to apply with low emissions. But that has to be developed in the years to come. At the same moment, what we see in agriculture, that is, we have a very high livestock density in the Netherlands, a combination of cattle, pork, and poultry. And due to that, we have quite severe restrictions on the emissions of phosphate, ammonia, but also nitrates. And we expect that in the years to come also greenhouse gas emissions will be added to that. What we see is that farmers respond to this, to these excretion criteria by improving their efficiency. Sorry. And this means that they go to higher milk productions per cow and optimized feeding with reducing the phosphate and nitrogen excretion of the animals, which means that in fact the whole livestock system is now optimized in service of the cow and also to pork. But this brings us to very high performance. And well, okay, it's really that high. Farmers are proud of that. At the same moment, they see that they're able to reduce emissions per liter of milk. But due to the fact that it's based on emission criteria, it means that every step in increasing efficiency leads to a higher milk production. Because if you are able to produce the same amount of milk with lower excretion, there is room for more excretion and you can produce more milk or have more pork. So we see that this intensification process is ongoing. At the same moment, there is a concern about soil quality, biodiversity, and landscape, which are also very important functions, especially of dairy farming. And we see there at the moment that there is also a friction between what citizens want and what farmers can provide. So part of the, we say, in fact, we need also a transition to other criteria than only excretion to be able also to provide the other products like landscape, water retention, but also for the farmer's interest himself, because we think that climate change requires a more resilient system than we have at this very moment. As I said, in housing, I discussed this morning with Kari, and then we were discussing also, building materials. You know, there is at this moment a trend coming up to circular building, so reusing materials, but also using new materials that can be reused in the next life of a housing system. And it's less looking at the material, whether it's concrete, steel, or wood. The search in the Netherlands is much more for the floor types, the ways to remove manure, the ways to store the manure, the dung and the urine, and the application technology. And one of the interesting findings, maybe you have heard of it, is also the cow toilet. which is in fact, well, it looks a little bit like a urinoir, but then for cows. And it's connected also to a feeding station, and when the cow is there, she's stimulated to pee, which means that part of the urine is captured completely separate from the dung. It doesn't even touch the floor. Well, this is one, you know, it looks funny really, but it's also one of the things that probably will be developed further to better separate dung and urine. Colleagues of mine are doing the same with pig farming, because we always say, well, we always speak about dumb pigs, but in fact they're quite intelligent, and you can learn them to defecate and to urinate in different places, which means that you can organize the separation of dung and urine in pig farming even better than in cattle farming. The big advantage is, as I said, an improved manure quality, but also a strong reduction in ammonia, but probably also, and that's what we are still researching, that's also a strong reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. So what we see is that methane emissions are very low in solid manure, and that's why we also recommend not to switch to deep pit systems where you use a lot of straw, because using a lot of straw will increase nitrous oxide emissions. And then it means that we shift from methane emissions to nitrous oxide emissions. So, well, then the net result is not exactly known, but in fact it's counteracting. So we say you can use some straw to make it to really a solid product that can be handled also by the solid manure equipment, because otherwise it might be too weak. But it does not mean that you have to go to systems where you use a lot of straw. On the other hand, we don't even have enough straw to go to such a system in the Netherlands. We would need 3 to 4 times as much straw as we have in the country. So it's also a system that cannot be scaled. So that's about the housing system. We see there that there are large potentials to reduce ammonia and methane emissions, and at the same moment to improve manure quality. Another trajectory that we are looking at in mitigating greenhouse gas emissions is the methane from rumen fermentation. And at this moment, in fact, colleagues of mine have been looking to, well, what's the effect of grass quality, what's the effect of the various components, and they have been able to develop a tier 3 methodology to simulate methane production from the rumen. And there we see that the different feed materials have different methane production. So we're able now to go to rations that produce less methane than others. But the most important steps will be, one is breeding. Colleagues have found out that there is a variation between animals in the methane production per kilo of intake, which means that we have low and high emission cows. So it must be able to select on that. And their expectation is that we are able, if such a program is in place, that we're able to reduce methane emissions from dairy cows by 1% per year. So it's adding up 1%, 2%, etc. So, well, it's not completely adding up, of course. It's more like an exponential function. But it means that in a period of 30 years, we make often at this moment an outlook to 2050, what is possible. Then we see that with this approach, we're able to reduce methane emissions by 20 to 25%. Another interesting trajectory is the use of additives. And there are a range of additives. They have looked at herbs, etc., also garlic. But we see that a number of these additives will affect the equilibrium in the rumen, but after a period of a number of weeks, the equilibrium is back in the old situation and methane reduction is gone. There are a number of products that give a permanent reduction of methane emissions. The one is the use of fats and oils in the feed. So compound feed companies try to add fats and oils to the feed, well, as much as possible, because if you add it, the pellet must really be a pellet and not fall apart. The other is that it is partly affecting the milk quality. So there is also a debate ongoing between compound feed industry and the dairy industry. Other means is, one is developed by Cargill, that's the use of nitrate, so feeding nitrate, and they have a lot of experience with it in feeding beef cattle. And that works quite well. They also seen methane reductions by 20 to 25%. And on one of our experimental farms, it also has been tested, and also with good results. Of course, proper distribution of the nitrate is desired. The other, that's a product that is being developed by the DSM, Dutch State Mines, and which has been tested on a number of places, and they will introduce it to the market in a few weeks. That's the name of the product is Bovar. They give it. That's the name they give it now. And what we see is that it's also leading to methane reductions of 20 to 30%. And these two products, so nitrate, but also the Bovar, is not working on the fermentation process itself, but really affecting the last step. So the last step from methane formation. And together, so the combination of breeding and the use of additives, we think that a reduction of 50% of methane emissions is possible in dairy cows. But of course, there is also a public debate ongoing around this, and you cannot ignore the importance of that debate. And that's, if you go, do you want to go to more natural systems where the use of additives is in fact not accepted, or are we willing to accept that we, well, in fact, are conditioning the natural process a bit more in order to reduce emissions? And that's in part, it's not only a rational discussion. So, but we will see what will come out in the next years. As I said, farmers are stimulated to intensify their production, to go to higher milk productions per cow, and also to extend the lifespan. And what we see that, you know, indeed, reduction of or increasing the milk production per cow will reduce greenhouse gas emissions per cow. I've worked at the Food and Agriculture Organization in 2009 and 2010, and with Professor Gerber, I also developed a relationship between milk production and greenhouse gas emissions per liter of milk. Is it possible to put that on the screen? I can show the screen that I have, but I think you're able to give a very good translation of that. This is the relationship that we developed, where you see that with low outputs per cow, you have very high emissions per liter of milk. And if you go to the right, to the higher milk productions, you see that it's getting lower to about, well, somewhere between 1 and 2 kilo of CO2 equivalents per liter of milk. But it levels off. But still, it's ongoing. As you see here, this is in fact what we are also seeing analysts at this moment. This is the greenhouse gas emissions per liter of milk, the blue bars. But what we see is that at this moment, well, in fact, it's also seen in national registration. But the point is that what we see with increasing milk production per cow, the amount of meat as a parallel production is decreasing. And well, the most left bar is a cow producing 6,000 liters with 2 lactations. So after 2 lactations, she is sent to the butcher, where the others have a 4 lactation period. And then you see that the amount of carcass weight, that's on the vertical axis, the amount of carcass weight per liter of milk is going down from, well, 40 in the highest situation to about 17 in the situation with 10,000 liters per cow. The brown or orange part is cooled cows, so the selling of dairy cows from the farm. The gray part, veal calves. This is for the Dutch situation where we produce veal. And the point is that our meat consumption in the Netherlands is higher than the meat production from our dairy cows. We are still importing beef from other countries, which means that if we go to a more efficient system in the Netherlands, we produce less meat, and it means that we have to compensate this by importing more beef from other countries. And that's the yellow bar that has been added to the picture. And if we combine that, here you saw this picture, what I showed you before. These are the greenhouse gas emissions per kilo of milk. These are the greenhouse gas emissions of the amount of carcass weight, orange-brown from the dairy cows, grey from the veal calves. And these are the greenhouse gas emissions from the imported beef to come to the same amount of meat, of carcass weight, per liter of milk, and that's 40 grams in this case. And then you see that increasing the milk production, in fact, does not reduce the emissions when you look at the consumer level. Well, and there is also a problem with that, because, you know, the dairy industry is only looking at the milk production. Beef industry is only looking at the beef production and the related emissions. But at the national level, intensification is not effective. But the point is, okay, who's at stake to organize that process? At the same moment, we also use this with a discussion in the Netherlands wait, I will go back to stop the presentation. Yeah. So also that we say, well, it means that if you go to a lower milk productions per cow, or if you don't intensify, in fact at the national level emissions stay the same, but it also gives room for a reconsideration of dual purpose cattle. I think you have more dual purpose cattle than we have, because I think 98% of the cows we have in the Netherlands is really completely milk type. It's all Holstein and with very little meat. So a number of farmers is inseminating part of their herd with meat type bulls to have some better calves. But we see that this animal is also quite vulnerable. She's very productive, but we think that also looking at what climate change will bring with weather extremes, feed shortages, heat waves, maybe other diseases, but also in a number of situations that we have to go to less optimal production conditions, we need a more resilient cow. Which means that we in the Netherlands are at this moment having a debate, would it be good to go back to more dual purpose cattle? And we have some older breeds that are still, well, there are a few percent of these animals. You count them in thousands, whereas the others are counted in millions. But they could be useful as well in breeding programs because they are more resilient. But they're more dual purpose cattle. The same what we see with the increase in the milk production is also occurring if you look at the extension of the lifespan of the animal, because extending the lifespan means that less calves are produced. You can send more calves to the fattening section, but in total less calves are produced, and it means that also less meat is produced, which again implies that more meat has to be imported. Of course, the story will change if you are also able to reduce beef consumption in a country, because then no compensation is needed. But then it means that it's a combination of intensifying agriculture at the same moment changing the people's diet. the most important things that we do and in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So looking to the housing system, looking to enteric fermentation, and also, well, to see, well, is this intensification still a very effective pathway or not? Well, those in fact, so I was very close to my conclusion already. So, but this is what I would like to share with you.
Yeah, thank you so much.